Hey class, so today's online lecture is going to be on fatigue, and we're going to look at both central and peripheral fatigue, meaning we're going to be looking at kind of neurological fatigue as well as what happens at the skeletal muscle as well. So four major causes of fatigue are inadequate energy delivery or metabolism, accumulation of metabolic byproducts, we're talking about lactate, hydrogen, so on and so forth, the failure of muscle contractile mechanisms. So basically there's some type of disconnect between acetylcholine, calcium release, and we'll go into more detail later, as well as altered neural control of muscular contraction. Again, still kind of that acetylcholine disruption is something that we'll talk about there. So in terms of energy systems, so we mentioned inadequate energy delivery and metabolism. So we'll have PCR depletion coincides with fatigue, especially for repeated contraction bouts of exercise. We do have we have limited glycogen reserves, only about 2,500 kcals compared to free fatty acids that has over 70,000 kcals in reserve. So a certain amount of glycogen is needed to keep the Krebs cycle going, especially at the intensity that we want to exercise at. With glycogen depletion, we do start to see free fatty acid metabolism increase. However, it's slow. Okay, and remember, if we're trying to exercise at a certain intensity, maybe win a race, then free fatty acid metabolism isn't our best friend. So here we can see in terms of muscle glycogen and exercise. So the longer that we start to exercise, the harder that we start to perceive. Okay, so that's perceived exertion on the right hand side. How hard we perceive exertion, kind of the longer it is. You can see we're starting to, that this individual is saying, I'm perceiving exercise to be extremely hard, mainly because their muscle glycogen is getting very low, which is on the left. So by metabolic byproducts, so phosphate, so from rapid breakdown of PCR and ATP, so we have an accumulation of phosphates. Heat retained by body, our core temperature starts to increase. Lactic acid, lactic acid, yes, we do clear it. We do use it as glucose. Too much of it, though, however, can start to inhibit contraction. Hydrogen, lactic acid, or lactate and hydrogen ions, as well as calcium issues. So the one thing to kind of go back to the phosphate is it can actually reduce calcium release from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So with heat, it alters our metabolic rate. So if we increase our body temperature, it's going to increase the rate of carbohydrate utilization, meaning we're going to burn through those carbohydrates or that glucose and glycogen stores a lot faster, and eventually impair muscular function. You can see based off of different temperatures in which people are exercising, their time to exhaustion, and the hotter it is, the faster they start to burn out. For lactic acid, if lactic acid isn't cleared, it starts to accumulate as lactate and hydrogen ions. This causes muscle pH to become more acidic, and the pH decreases. Can cause pain, nausea, as well as disorientation, which is why some people, when they exercise really hard, might feel like they need to throw up. It's because of that lactic acid hydrogen byproduct. We do have buffers that help to minimize the drop in pH because we don't want to have our pH drop too low because otherwise the cells won't survive and they won't function very well. So if our pH, though, does get less than 6.9, we'll see it inhibits glycolytic enzymes, meaning the production of breaking down of glycogen to glucose to then create pyruvate, go to acetyl-CoA, so on and so forth, starts to be inhibited. So PFK can get inhibited. Hydrogen moves calcium into the muscle. And then we'll also see that we have inhibit of ATP synthesis. So for pH, if it equals 6.4, okay, prevents further glycogen breakdown. So our buffer helps to not let that pH get too low. Obviously 6.4, we're starting to get extremely low, but as it keeps getting lower and lower, we'll see an inhibition of O2 binding to hemoglobin, If O2 is not binding to hemoglobin, that oxygen is not going to the muscle. But we're also trying to limit the release of, and use of free fatty acids. So here's just to show you guys what muscle pH looks like in terms of if someone sprinted, and then in terms of their minute recovery, it takes them about 35 minutes to recover their pH. With calcium for metabolic byproducts, we know that it's released by the sarcoplasmic reticulum, can be taken up by the mitochondria. It could that calcium that is free flowing within the muscle cell can actually interfere with certain enzymes. That's those glycogen enzymes. The sarcoplasmic reticulum can also lose the ability to release calcium, meaning the contraction strength decreases. We can attenuate this by caffeine, which is why we drink caffeine, but it would have to be an excessive amount of caffeine, not just like a cup of coffee. Actin can eventually become less sensitive to calcium, and then it can also block the release of acetylcholine. So if we're blocking the release of acetylcholine, we're going to see a decrease in calcium influx, reduction in calcium sensitivity within the nerve terminal. Now we can also have, in terms of neurotransmission, we can have failure at the neuromuscular junction. So if we have decreased acetylcholine synthesis and release, we know that we're not going to have action potentials consistently going to the muscle cell. Can also inhibit release calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. We mentioned that. And this decreased neural drive is usually seen with repeated bouts of contractions, is related to blood glucose falling and a decrease of the oxygen level within the muscle. Now, soreness. We should know that soreness is not caused by lactic acid. However, during and or immediately following strenuous exercise, we see an increase in hydrogen ions. We have tissue edema, and edema meaning we're going to have acute swelling. So you might kind of think of that muscle pump that you get, but that can actually be kind of painful when you start to move acutely. These usually disappear within minutes to hours, but a lot of people, when they feel an accumulation of hydrogen, it's painful. They don't like, you hear someone say, oh, this exercise is painful. Usually disappears, but when we talk about being sore the next day, we're talking about delayed onset muscle soreness, which we can kind of describe as like a female, because delayed onset muscle soreness reminds you what you did wrong 24, 48, 72 hours later, and kind of reminds you and says, hey, did you do this? And you're like, oh man. So I like to think that Dom's kind of like that female that reminds you, because girls just don't forget. But we see a decrease in muscle force with soreness, and a loss of strength is usually from physical disruption of the muscle at the Z-discs. We could have failure in that excitation-contraction coupling, which is the acetylcholine issue, or we could have loss of certain contractile proteins. So here's just a chart to show you guys a little bit in terms of the days after injury, skeletal muscle injury, which is just kind of after you've exercised, strength loss due to mainly that excitation-contraction coupling, and then the loss of the contractile proteins, in which eventually, those repair and regenerate. So our last one on the CNS plays a role in fatigue, but we're still kind of trying to figure it out. And fiber recruitment does have a conscious aspect. Stress of exhaustive exercise may just be too much. We might be subconsciously or consciously unwilling to endure pain. However, verbal encouragement does help. We've seen that in VO2 max tests, where people will actually be able to push a little bit farther because they're being cheered on, and that's why we do that. Some people start to feel discomfort. It's kind of a warning sign. We'll look at rate of perceived exertion as well and say, okay, how comfortable are you? And they're like, no, I want to be done. Usually, though, what we see is that elite athletes learn proper pacing, and they can actually tolerate this fatigue. So it is something that is kind of learned. So that's this lecture on fatigue, both central nervous system as well as peripheral fatigue. And there you have it.